The plane touched down at Chicago O'Hare with a loud thud that made Maria's stomach jump. She looked over at her younger sister Elena, who was gripping the armrest so tight her knuckles had turned white. Neither of them had ever been on a plane before, and now here they were, thousands of miles away from everything they had ever known. Maria was 19 years old, and Elena had just turned 17 the week before they left home. They sat in their cramped airplane seats, watching through the small window as the busy airport came into view. The February wind was howling outside, and they could see snow covering everything like a thick white blanket. "Are you ready?" Maria whispered to Elena in Spanish. Her voice was shaking, but she tried to sound brave for her little sister. Elena nodded, but her eyes were filled with worry. They both knew this wasn't a vacation or a fun trip. This was their only chance at survival. Back home in Venezuela, life had become impossible. Their parents had disappeared 3 months ago during one of the government raids in their neighborhood. One day they were there making breakfast and laughing at the kitchen table, and the next day they were gone. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing. The sisters had tried to stay and wait for their parents to come back, but the situation got worse every day. There was no food in the stores, no medicine in the hospitals, and no safety anywhere. Their neighbors started disappearing too, one by one, when armed men began asking questions about their family. Maria knew they had to leave immediately. Their only hope was their cousin Roberto, who had moved to Chicago 5 years earlier. He had promised to help them if they could somehow make it to America. The sisters had sold everything they owned just to buy plane tickets and get tourist visas. But by the time they actually left, those visas had already expired. Now, walking through the busy airport terminal, they felt completely lost. The signs were all in English, which they barely understood. People rushed past them speaking a language that sounded like noise to their ears. Everything was so fast, so cold, so different. The immigration officer looked at their documents with a frown. He asked them questions in rapid English that they couldn't understand. Maria tried her best to explain in broken English that they were visiting family, but the man's expression grew more suspicious with every word. After what felt like hours of questions and phone calls, they were finally allowed to enter the country, but with a stern warning that their visa situation needed to be resolved immediately. They nodded and smiled, pretending to understand everything he said, but inside they were terrified. Roberto was supposed to pick them up at the airport, but when they got to the meeting spot, he wasn't there. They waited for 2 hours, taking turns watching their small bag while the other one looked around for him. Finally, Maria used one of the payphones to call the number he had given them. "Roberto, it's Maria. We're here at the airport," she said in Spanish. There was a long pause. On the other end, "Maria, listen, I'm really sorry, but things have changed. I lost my job last month, and my wife is pregnant. We're barely making ends meet ourselves." Maria's heart sank. "But Roberto, we have nowhere else to go. Look, I can let you stay on my couch for maybe 2 weeks, but that's all I can do. You need to figure something else out after that." The bus ride to Roberto's apartment took over an hour. They watched the city pass by through dirty windows, seeing tall buildings, busy streets, and people bundled up in thick winter coats. It was nothing like the warm, colorful streets they had grown up on. Roberto's apartment was tiny and cramped. He lived with his pregnant wife Carmen and their 2 young children in a 2-bedroom place that barely had enough room for their own family. When Maria and Elena walked in with their plastic bag of belongings, everyone felt the tension immediately. Carmen tried to be welcoming at first, but as the days went by, it became clear that having 2 extra people in their small space was creating serious problems. The children had to sleep in their parents' rooms so the sisters could use the couch. There wasn't enough food to go around, and the single bathroom was constantly occupied. Roberto worked construction jobs during the day and drove for a delivery company at night just to pay rent. He was exhausted all the time, and the stress of supporting his family plus 2 additional people was wearing him down quickly. "I'm really sorry," he told Maria on their 10th day there. "But Carmen is getting really stressed about the baby coming, and we just can't do this anymore. You're going to have to find somewhere else to go." Maria begged him for more time. "Just one more week, please. I'll find work. I'll help pay for food." But Roberto shook his head sadly. "Without proper papers, no one is going to hire you, and even if they did, it wouldn't be enough to get your own place. I'm sorry, but you have to leave by Sunday." That night, Maria and Elena lay on the couch whispering to each other in the dark. They had less than $50 between them, no jobs, no legal status, and now no place to live. Outside, the Chicago winter wind was howling, and the temperature was dropping below freezing. "What are we going to do?" Elena asked, trying not to cry. Maria put her arm around her sister and held her close. "We'll figure something out. We have to." But deep down, Maria was more scared than she had ever been in her life. They were completely alone in a city of millions of people, and nobody seemed to care whether they lived or died. Sunday morning came too fast. Maria and Elena packed their few belongings into the same plastic bags they had arrived with and walked out into the freezing Chicago streets. The cold hit them like a slap in the face, and within minutes their fingers were numb and their teeth were chattering. They had no idea where to go. Maria remembered seeing a public library during one of their walks around the neighborhood, so they headed there first. At least it would be warm, and maybe they could figure out their next move. The library became their first refuge. They spent the entire first day there, sitting in the corner trying to look like they were reading while actually trying not to panic. When closing time came at 6 o'clock, they had to leave and face the brutal reality of having nowhere to sleep. That first night, they found a 24-hour laundromat a few blocks away. The owner, an elderly Korean man, didn't seem to mind them sitting there as long as they weren't causing trouble. They took turns sleeping while the other one stayed awake to watch their bag and make sure they were safe. The fluorescent lights buzzed loudly all night, and the washing machines made constant noise. The hard plastic chairs hurt their backs, and every time someone came in to do laundry, they had to pretend they were waiting for their clothes to finish. But at least they were warm and out of the snow dot by the third day. Maria knew she had to find work. She walked from store to store, restaurant to restaurant, asking if they were hiring. Her English was limited, but she tried her best to communicate that she was a hard worker and would do anything. Most places wouldn't even let her fill out an application. As soon as they asked for identification and she couldn't produce the right documents, the conversation was over. The few managers who seemed sympathetic would shake their heads and say they were sorry, but their hands were tied. "I wish I could help you," one restaurant owner told her. "But if the government finds out I hired someone without proper papers, they could shut down my whole business." Elena, meanwhile, was getting sicker. The stress, the cold, and sleeping in uncomfortable places every night was wearing her down. She developed a cough that kept getting worse, and Maria could see dark circles forming under her sister's eyes. They learned to time their days around free resources. The library opened at 9, so they would be there right when the doors opened. They discovered that some grocery stores gave out free samples, and they would walk slowly through those aisles, taking small bites and trying to make it look casual. The hardest part was finding places to clean up. Public restrooms became their bathrooms, and they learned which ones were the cleanest and safest. They would take turns washing their hair in sinks when no one was looking, and they tried their best to keep their clothes clean. After 2 weeks of this routine, Maria finally found someone willing to hire her. It was a small factory owner who needed people to sort recycling materials. The work was dirty and dangerous, and he paid far below minimum wage. But he didn't ask too many questions about documentation. Maria's hands were cut and bruised from handling sharp metal and broken glass all day. The factory was cold, smelly, and filled with toxic fumes that made her head hurt. But she was grateful to have any income at all. Even with the job, they couldn't afford an apartment. The money Maria made in a week wasn't even enough for one night in the cheapest motel. They continued sleeping in the laundromat, the library when possible, and sometimes under highway overpasses when they had no other choice. Food became an obsession. They would split a single hamburger from the dollar menu and call it dinner. On good days, they might find day-old bread that a bakery was throwing away. Maria started losing weight rapidly, and she could see her cheekbones becoming more prominent in her reflection. Elena's cough got so bad that she could barely sleep at night. Maria was terrified that her sister was developing pneumonia or something worse, but taking her to a hospital seemed impossible. They had no insurance, no money, and no legal status. Everything came to a head on a particularly cold Thursday in March. Elena had been feeling dizzy all morning, but she insisted she was fine. They were walking to the library when suddenly Elena just collapsed on the sidewalk. A woman passing by saw what happened and immediately called for help. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived and paramedics were checking Elena's vital signs. Maria was crying and trying to explain in broken English that her sister hadn't eaten much in days. At the hospital, Elena was diagnosed with severe dehydration and malnutrition. The doctors and nurses were kind and professional, but when it came time to discuss payment and insurance, the conversation became awkward and uncomfortable. The social worker who came to speak with them was sympathetic but direct. Without insurance, this visit is going to cost thousands of dollars, and your sister really needs to see a specialist about that cough. Maria felt completely helpless. They discharged Elena with some basic medications and a bill that might as well have been $1 million. Walking out of that hospital, both sisters felt like the whole world had turned its back on them that night. Huddled together in an abandoned building they had discovered, Elena looked at her older sister with tears in her eyes. "Maybe we should just go back home," she whispered. "At least there we knew the language." But Maria shook her head. "There's nothing left for us there. We just have to keep trying." Neither of them believed those words anymore, but they were all they had left. It was on their darkest day, 3 weeks after Elena's hospital visit, that everything changed. The sisters had been walking around the south side of Chicago, looking for any place that might have work or food, when Maria spotted a small church with a sign out front that said free community meal, Tuesdays and Fridays. It was a Friday, and Maria's stomach was cramping from hunger. She hadn't eaten anything in days, giving what little food they had found to Elena, who was still weak and coughing. "Should we try?" Maria asked, looking at the modest brick building. They had avoided churches so far, not because they weren't religious, but because they were afraid of being turned away or judged. Elena nodded weakly. They didn't have many options left. The church was called St. Augustine's Community Church, and it was smaller than the grand churches they had known back home. But there was something warm and welcoming about it, even from the outside. They could smell food cooking, and through the windows, they could see people sitting at tables, eating and talking. Maria took a deep breath and pushed open the front door. A few people looked up when they entered, but no one seemed alarmed or unwelcoming. A middle-aged black man wearing casual clothes and a warm smile approached them immediately. "Welcome to St. Augustine's," he said in a gentle voice. "Are you here for the community meal?" Maria nodded, not trusting herself to speak without crying. She was so hungry and tired that even this small kindness felt overwhelming. The man introduced himself as Pastor James Morrison. He was about 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Unlike other authority figures they had encountered, he didn't immediately start asking questions about who they were or where they came from. Instead, he simply led them to a table and brought them each a plate of food. It was simple fare: meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll. But to Maria and Elena, it might as well have been a feast prepared by angels. They ate slowly, trying not to look desperate, but Pastor Morrison seemed to understand exactly what they were going through. He sat down across from them and started talking in a casual, friendly way that put them at ease. "I grew up not too far from here," he told them. "My family didn't have much when I was young. I remember what it feels like to be really hungry." Elena looked up from her plate, surprised by his honesty. Most people they had encountered either ignored their situation completely or made them feel ashamed of it. after they finished eating. Pastor Morrison asked if they would like some coffee and dessert as they sat drinking coffee and eating slices of homemade apple pie. He gently asked about their story. Maria found herself opening up in a way she hadn't with anyone since they arrived in Chicago. Maybe it was because he didn't start by asking about their legal status, or maybe it was because he really seemed to be listening. She told him about their parents, about fleeing their country, about being turned away by their cousin, and about living on the streets. Pastor Morrison listened to every word without interrupting. When Elena started coughing badly, he immediately got up and brought her a glass of water and some throat lozenges from the church office. "How long have you been without a place to stay?" he asked, and his concern seemed genuine. "About a month," Maria admitted, feeling embarrassed. Pastor Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he looked at both sisters with an expression they hadn't seen in a long time. Not pity, but actual caring. "Listen," he said slowly. "I need to talk to my wife about this, but we might be able to help you with a place to stay, at least temporarily." Maria and Elena looked at each other, hardly daring to hope. They had been disappointed so many times that they were afraid to believe this could be real. Pastor Morrison left them at the table and went to make a phone call. They could hear him talking quietly on the phone for several minutes. When he came back, he was smiling. "Okay," he said. "My wife Catherine and I talked about it, and we'd like to offer you the apartment upstairs. It's not fancy, just 2 beds, a small kitchen, and a bathroom, but it's warm and safe." Elena started crying right there at the table, not from sadness this time, but from relief and gratitude that she couldn't put into words. "We don't have money to pay rent," Maria said honestly. "I have a job, but it doesn't pay much." Pastor Morrison waved his hand dismissively. "Don't worry about that right now. Let's just get you somewhere safe to sleep, and we can figure out the rest later." That night, for the first time in over a month, Maria and Elena slept in real beds with clean sheets and warm blankets. The apartment was simple, just like Pastor Morrison had said, but to them it felt like a palace. Elena's cough started getting better almost immediately, just from having a warm, dry place to sleep and regular meals. Maria couldn't believe that someone would help them without asking for anything in return, without even knowing their real names or their legal status. The next morning, Pastor Morrison knocked on their door with breakfast and some basic groceries. "I thought you might be hungry," he said with that same warm smile. As they sat eating breakfast together, Maria finally asked the question that had been bothering her all night. "Why are you helping us? You don't even know us." Pastor Morrison was quiet for a moment, sipping his coffee. Then he looked at both sisters with a serious but kind expression. "You know," he said, "I've been a pastor for over 20 years, and I've learned that faith isn't just about what you believe, it's about what you do. When I see people who are hungry and homeless, I don't see their immigration status or their paperwork. I see human beings who need help." He paused, then smiled again. "Besides, my grandmother used to say that sometimes God sends angels disguised as people who need our help. Maybe you're here to teach us something too." Over the next few days, some members of the congregation had mixed reactions to Pastor Morrison's decision to house the sisters. A few people questioned whether it was legal or wise to help undocumented immigrants. But Pastor Morrison stood firm during Sunday service. He gave a sermon about compassion that moved many people to tears. When someone is hungry, do we ask to see their papers before we feed them? He asked the congregation. When someone is cold, do we check their citizenship before we offer them warmth? The Bible tells us to welcome strangers, not to welcome only the strangers who have the right documents. After that sermon, the opposition largely disappeared, and many congregation members began asking how they could help support Maria and Elena. Spring finally arrived in Chicago, and with it came a transformation that Maria and Elena never expected. Having a safe place to sleep and regular meals had changed everything about their daily lives. Elena's cough disappeared completely, and both sisters started to look healthy again. But more importantly, they began to feel like human beings again instead of just survivors. Pastor Morrison had a way of making them feel useful, rather than like charity cases. On their second weekend, the apartment, he knocked on their door with a proposal that would change their lives forever. "We're starting our spring community outreach programs," he explained, sitting at their small kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "I was wondering if you two might be interested in helping out. It's not paid work, but it would give you something meaningful to do while you're getting back on your feet." Maria and Elena looked at each other with excitement. They had been feeling restless, grateful for the help, but also eager to contribute something back to the community that had welcomed them. Their first assignment was helping with the weekly community meals that had saved their lives just weeks before. Maria worked in the kitchen, learning to prepare large quantities of food, while Elena helped serve meals and clean tables. It felt wonderful to be on the other side of the serving line, helping other people who were struggling just like they had been. Elena discovered something surprising about herself during those first days of volunteering. Despite her limited English, she had a natural gift for connecting with people. There was something about her gentle smile and patient manner that put even the most difficult visitors at ease. One afternoon, a homeless veteran named Mr. Johnson came in for lunch. He was angry and suspicious, snapping at volunteers and complaining about everything. Most people tried to avoid him, but Elena approached him with kindness and patience. She couldn't understand all of his words, but she could see the pain in his eyes. She sat with him while he ate, listening to him talk and occasionally nodding or offering encouraging sounds. By the end of the meal, Mr. Johnson was actually smiling and thanking her. "That girl has a gift," Pastor Morrison told Maria that evening. "She sees people's hearts, not just their problems." As the weeks went on, Elena's role at the church expanded naturally. She started helping with the after-school program for neighborhood children. The kids loved her immediately, drawn to her playful spirit and the fact that she didn't talk down to them like many adults did. Even though her English was still developing, Elena found ways to communicate with the children through games, drawing, and simple activities. She helped them with homework, played games with them in the church basement, and always made sure each child felt special and important. One little girl named Lucy had been acting out and causing problems for months. She was 7 years old, living with her grandmother and angry at the world. But Elena spent extra time with her, teaching her to draw and listening to her stories. Gradually, Lucy's behavior improved, and she started looking forward to coming to the after-school program. Maria, meanwhile, was using her organizational skills to help improve the church's various programs. She noticed that the food distribution system was chaotic and inefficient, with long lines and confusion about who was eligible for help. Working with Catherine Morrison, the pastor's wife, Maria redesigned the entire system. She created a simple check-in process, organized the food pantry more logically, and established a system for tracking what families needed most. The changes reduced waiting times and helped the church serve twice as many families with the same amount of resources. "You have a mind for business," Catherine told Maria one day as they reviewed the new systems. "Have you ever thought about going back to school?" The idea had seemed impossible when they were living on the streets, but now it felt like maybe, just maybe, it could become reality. Pastor Morrison helped Maria research community college programs and financial aid options. Both sisters enrolled in English as a second language classes at the local community college. The classes were held in the evenings, and they studied together every night in their small apartment, helping each other with pronunciation and grammar. Elena decided to focus on early childhood education, inspired by her work with the kids at church. She dreamed of becoming a teacher someday, helping children learn and grow. Maria chose business administration, hoping to someday start her own company helping other immigrant families. Their progress was remarkable. Within 6 months, they were speaking English confidently and had become integral parts of the church community. People who had initially been skeptical about Pastor Morrison's decision to help them now couldn't imagine the church functioning without them. Word about their story began to spread throughout the youth side. Other churches reached out to Pastor Morrison, asking for advice about how to help immigrants and refugees in their own communities. Local newspapers heard about the sisters and wanted to write their story, but Pastor Morrison was careful to protect their privacy while highlighting the broader issues. A local television station did a feature story about St. Augustine's community programs focusing on how the church was making a difference in the neighborhood. While they didn't use Maria and Elena's real names or show their faces clearly, the story highlighted how people who had received help were now giving back to others. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from viewers who were moved by the story. Volunteers signed up to help with various programs. Other churches across Chicago began implementing similar community outreach initiatives. But perhaps the most meaningful change was within the congregation of St. Augustine's itself. Members who had never been involved in community service began volunteering regularly. The church's programs expanded to include job training, legal aid clinics, and English classes for immigrants. Maria and Elena had become catalysts for change without even realizing it. Their gratitude and hard work had inspired an entire community to become more compassionate and more involved in helping others. One evening, as they sat in their small apartment reviewing their homework, Elena looked up from her textbook with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think Mama and Papa would be proud of us?" she asked quietly. Maria smiled and reached over to squeeze her sister's hand. "I think they would be amazed at how strong you've become and how much good we're doing here." It was true. They had arrived in Chicago as desperate refugees, but they were becoming something entirely different: community leaders, bridge builders, and proof that with the right support, anyone could transform their life and help others do the same. 2 years had passed since that freezing February day when Maria and Elena first arrived in Chicago. Now, sitting in the graduation ceremony at the community college, wearing caps and gowns and surrounded by their church family, it was hard to believe they were the same frightened girls who had once slept in laundromats. Maria graduated with honors in business administration, while Elena completed her associate degree in early childhood education. Pastor Morrison and his wife Catherine sat in the front row, beaming with pride like the proud parents they had become to both sisters. But the real celebration wasn't just about their academic achievements through Pastor Morrison's connections with immigration lawyers who donated their time to help refugees. Maria and Elena had finally been able to straighten out their legal status. The process had taken over a year and involved countless meetings, paperwork, and court appearances. But they were now legal residents with the right to work and build their future in America. Maria's first real job came through a contact Catherine Morrison had made at the community college. A local accounting firm needed someone bilingual to help serve their growing number of Hispanic clients. Maria's combination of business skills and personal understanding of immigrant struggles made her perfect for the position. Within 6 months, Maria had impressed her bosses so much that they encouraged her to start her own side business, providing translation and consultation services for immigrant families. Working evenings and weekends, she helped other families navigate the complex systems of healthcare, education, legal services, and government benefits. Her little business grew quickly through word of mouth. Families would come to her not just for translation, but for guidance on everything from opening bank accounts to understanding their children's school reports. She charged reasonable fees, often working for free when families couldn't afford to pay. Elena had found her calling working as a teacher's aide at Lincoln Elementary School, the same school where many of the children from the church's after-school program attended. The principal had been so impressed with Elena's natural ability with children that she offered her a position even before she graduated. The children adored Elena. She had a special talent for reaching kids who were struggling, especially those from immigrant families who felt caught between two worlds. She understood their challenges in a way that other teachers couldn't, and she became a bridge between home and school for many families. One of her greatest success stories was helping a shy boy named Carlos who had arrived from Guatemala speaking no English. When Carlos first entered her classroom, he wouldn't speak to anyone and spent most days hiding in the corner. But Elena worked with him patiently, using games and activities to help him feel comfortable. By the end of the school year, Carlos was not only speaking English fluently, but had become one of the most confident kids in his class. His transformation reminded Elena of her own journey and motivated her to continue her education toward becoming a full teacher. The success of both sisters had not gone unnoticed in their community. They were regularly invited to speak at other churches and community organizations about their experiences. Their message was always the same, with compassion and support. Anyone could overcome incredible challenges and give back to others. But Maria and Elena wanted to do more than just tell their story. They wanted to create lasting change that would help other families avoid the desperate situations they had faced. Working with Pastor Morrison and several other community leaders, they founded the Second Chance Foundation. The organization's mission was simple: provide temporary housing, job training, and educational support for young immigrants and refugees who found themselves alone and struggling. Their first project was renovating an old apartment building that the church had purchased with donations from the community. The building had 12 units, and they transformed it into transitional housing for families in crisis. Each apartment came furnished with basic necessities, and residents could stay for up to 2 years while they got back on their feet. But this wasn't just charity. Residents were expected to contribute to the community through volunteer work and were provided with job training, English classes, and other support services. Elena designed and ran educational programs for the children living in the building, making sure they didn't fall behind in school while their families worked to stabilize their situations. Maria handled the business side, managing finances, coordinating with social services, and helping adults find employment. The community center on the first floor of the building became a hub of activity and housed English classes, job placement, services, childcare, and a small clinic where volunteer doctors provided basic health care services. The Second Chance Foundation quickly became a model that other cities wanted to replicate. Maria and Elena found themselves traveling to conferences and meetings, sharing their approach with social workers, religious leaders, and government officials. Pastor Morrison, now in his mid-50s, often reflected on how the desperate young women had ended up transforming not just his church, but his entire understanding of ministry and community service. "I thought I was helping them," he told his congregation during one Sunday sermon. "But the truth is, they saved us. They showed us what our faith really means and what our community could become. When we truly care for each other, the church had grown significantly, not just in numbers, but in its commitment to social justice and community service. Members who had never volunteered before were now running programs, mentoring families, and advocating for policy changes that would help immigrants and refugees. 3 years after founding the Second Chance Foundation, Maria and Elena stood in front of their newest project, a second building that would house their expanded programs. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by the mayor, several city council members, and hundreds of community supporters. But the people Maria and Elena were most excited to see were the families they had helped over the years. Dozens of former residents came back to celebrate, bringing their children and sharing updates about their lives. There was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had arrived with 3 young children after fleeing domestic violence and was now working as a nurse's aide. There was Ahmed, a young man from Somalia who had lived in their building while finishing high school and was now in his second year of college studying engineering. Each success story reminded the sisters why their work mattered so much. They knew firsthand how terrifying it could be to face the world alone, and they were determined that no one else would have to experience that level of desperation. During her speech at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, Elena spoke about their journey, with tears in her eyes. 3 years ago, my sister and I were sleeping in a laundromat, wondering if anyone in this city would ever care whether we lived or died, she said. Today, we're standing here surrounded by hundreds of people who have become our family and our partners in helping others. She paused, looking at Pastor Morrison, who was wiping away his own tears. Pastor Morrison didn't just save our lives that day when he invited us into his church. Elena continued. He showed us that home isn't a place you're born. It's a place where someone sees your worth and gives you the chance to prove it. The applause was thunderous. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the ceremony or the newspaper coverage. It was in the quiet moments, a child getting help with homework, a mother finding a job, a family moving into their own apartment after months of rebuilding their lives. Maria and Elena had learned that individual acts of compassion could create ripple effects that change entire communities. They had arrived as refugees seeking help, but they had become proof that with the right support, anyone could transform not just their own life, but the lives of countless others. That evening, back in their small apartment above the church where their new life had begun, the sisters sat together reviewing applications from families who needed help. Outside, Chicago hummed with life, and they were no longer strangers in a strange land. They were home.